Residents at 23 Cranley Gardens flats in North London were fed up on the morning of February 8, 1983. All their toilets were clogged, and it had been almost 2 days since they'd been able to flush. And not only that, there was a rancid, disgusting smell coming from the pipes. Now, a plumber had been called the day before to come out and clean the sewer system, and when he lifted the drain cover outside, he saw what looked like bones and human flesh. But when he called his supervisor over to take a look, they figured, come on, it could not be what they thought it was. And it was starting to get dark, so they didn't really get a chance to pull it out. But they figured, well, maybe someone had flushed chicken down the toilet. So when they came back the next morning to get a better look, and the stuff was gone, they got suspicious. So they checked each pipe carefully, and the one coming from the top floor of the building, that's where they found smaller pieces of that flesh, as well as more bones. They had no idea they were looking at a victim of one of England's most terrifying serial killers, Dennis Nilsen. And for him, murder was only the beginning. You have to hear this story to believe it. Hey, I'm Amy, and this is True Crime Recaps. So let me put it to you this way. If Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy had a Scottish baby, it would be Dennis Nilsen. And if he hadn't complained to his landlord about those clogged pipes, he might have taken more lives than both those notorious killers combined. But yeah, as nuts as it sounds, he was the one who insisted the building management call a plumber. At the time, he was 38 years old. He was living in the apartment on the top floor. And after they found what looked like a hand in the drain outside, the plumbers called the police. Dennis was at work at the time, so they waited at the gate for him to come home. And when they walked into his apartment, they were overwhelmed by the terrible smell. They asked him where the rest of the body was, and he calmly pointed to his closet. Inside were legs and a torso stashed in 2 garbage bags. Apparently, he was waiting for the pipes to be cleaned out so he could chop up the pieces small enough to flush them down the toilet. And when they asked him if there were more remains in the apartment, he told them it was a long story, but he wanted to go to the police station to tell it. On the ride there, one of the officers asked how many victims were there, and calmly Dennis stared out the back window, watching the buildings whiz past for a moment or two before he said there were at least 15 others going back all the way to 1978. But now that they had him, he was ready to talk. So his victims were all young men and boys, mostly homeless and gay or willing to be for some pocket money and a hot meal. He picked them up in bars around London or he met them on the street. He promised them food and cash if they came home with him, and once he shut the door behind them, they were his to do with as he wanted. He confessed to plying them with food and booze before he strangled them. He liked to kill them that way so he could see their eyes. Sometimes, if the situation called for it, he drowned them instead, and sometimes he did both. He preferred his dates dead. He liked to turn their corpses into his dolls. He washed them, he dressed them, he raped them, and he even posed them for pictures, cuddled up next to them. He propped them up beside him on the couch to keep him company while he watched TV, and then he stashed them under the floorboards until he wanted their company again. Weeks or months later, he would find someone new, and the body he'd been cuddling with would be dismembered, the brains boiled away in a cooking pot on the stove, the internal organs thrown away or burned, and anything that was left would be flushed. Before he moved to Cranley Gardens, he lived in a place on Melrose Avenue. That apartment had a yard where he could burn or bury the bodies when he got tired of them, but he was forced to move out because the owner wanted to renovate and sell it. His new place didn't have a yard, so he had to get creative and use the toilet to get rid of them instead. How does a person get like this? What led him down this depraved road? So to answer that question, we have to go back to the beginning. The moment when Dennis himself says it all went wrong. Scotland, 1951. He was 6. His mother and his 2 siblings were living with his grandfather after a rocky ending with his father 3 years earlier. But despite that, unlike other serial killers, he was loved. He was cared for by the people around him. And Des, that's what everyone called him, Des developed a special bond with his grandfather until one day, out of nowhere, the man had a heart attack and died while he was out at sea fishing. But see, no one told little Des that his grandfather was dead when they took him to see the body in the casket. Instead, his mother told him he was sleeping and he'd gone on to a better place. That moment when he saw his beloved grandfather's lifeless body changed him forever. For some reason, the line between life and death became permanently blurred. So after the viewing, he was quiet. He was quieter than he'd ever been before. He never really seemed to snap out of it. He kept to himself, kept away from his family. He shoved aside their attempts to comfort him, and he built a wall around himself and his heart, becoming, for all intents and purposes, completely alone. Later, much later, he talked about it with author Brian Master for his book called Killing for Company. And here's what he had to say. My troubles started there. It blighted my personality permanently. I have spent all my emotional life searching for my grandfather, and in my formative years, no one was there to take his place. So he literally started killing for companionship. At age 16, Des joined the army, and he was put to work as a cook. That's where he picked up the butchery skills that would serve a more nefarious purpose during his nearly 6-year killing spree. He was also keenly aware that he preferred the company of men more than women. But at that time, he wasn't, raising his hand to let people know he was gay. He kept that side of him buried deep down. He did his best to fit in, but he had a lot of weird quirks, like pretending to faint and play dead. So by this time, he was drinking a lot, and he liked to pretend he was drunker than he was, like in hopes someone would come over and take advantage of him. But no one did. But playing dead was another favorite. He used to ask other soldiers to take pictures of him pretending to be a corpse. We can assume he wasn't the most popular guy on the base. But the regimented life of a soldier seemed to agree with him. He spent 11 years in the service and became a corporal. After the army, he decided to join the Metropolitan Police Force in London. He moved there in 1973, and he describes it as like this sexual awakening for him. London's gay club scene accepted him, but after hooking up a few times, he started to hate that one-and-done hookup mentality that the men he met had. He wanted a relationship. And being a cop, it wasn't the thrill he thought it was either. Even though his job on the force did, give him access to the morgue and autopsies, which fascinated him. But he ended up quitting after only 11 months, and he took a job as a security guard. Behind closed doors, he spiraled. He was drinking a lot. His father died, and his longest relationship, a man that he actually lived with for 2 years, that had just fallen apart. Fortunately for that guy, he left with his life in 1977. So Dennis was alone, and he was searching for this end to this loneliness. That was the headspace he was in when he met 14-year-old Stephen Holmes in a nearby pub at the end of December in 1978. The kid had been at a concert. He was at the pub trying to convince someone to serve him, but he looked exactly his age. So, no one behind the bar was giving him booze. So Dennis invites him back to his place to listen to music, have a few drinks, and the two of them ended up drinking all night and falling asleep. The next morning, Des decides the kid was going to spend New Year's Eve with him whether he wanted to or not. Well, we can assume that Stephen told him that he wanted to leave because Des grabbed a tie and strangled him until he passed out. Then he drowned him in a bucket of water until he died. What he did next became the sick and twisted ritual he continued with his next 14 victims. He stripped his body, he ran a bath, he washed him, After drying him off with a towel, he carried him back to bed and snuggled up next to him under the duvet while he thought about what he should do next. So he decided he needed to get rid of the body. So he went to a nearby store to buy an electric carving knife, thinking he would dismember him. But once he was back home, actually in front of Stephen's body, he couldn't go through with it. He didn't want to let him go. So he redressed him and put him back in bed. He tried to rape him, but he couldn't do it. So he pushed the poor boy's corpse out of bed and fell asleep. The next day, he hid Stephen's body under the floorboards. And over the next 2 days, he brought him back out to spend time with him, like the way you would with a favorite doll. But eventually, the body just wasn't in any shape to cuddle with. So he left him hidden under the floor for the next 8 months. Eventually, the smell got to be too much, so he took him out to the backyard and he burned what was left of his body. He threw an old tire into the fire to cover up the smell. Sound insane? Too crazy to be true? Well, there's got to be something to it because these details all came from Dennis himself. After his arrest, he wrote extensive notes and journals about his crimes. He claimed he wanted to know why he did what he did just as much as we do. And interestingly, some of the men he invited home walked back out again. He didn't kill everyone he took a fancy to. Other times, when he tried to kill someone he liked a lot, they managed to fight their way out. At least 7 other men managed to escape his house of horrors, and at least one of them went to the police, but they blew him off and chalked the marks on his neck up to a gay lover's tiff. Can you believe it? Between 1978 and 1981, he killed 12 men and boys at his place on Melrose Avenue. Oh my God, I almost said Melrose Place, but that would be like a whole other story. And the really sad thing is, we don't even know all his victims' names because he liked to pick up sex workers or homeless people and drunk guys, and sometimes he didn't even get their first name before he took their life. So most of them are still unidentified today. By 1981, the landlord decided he had to go so the property could be renovated. So he had one last fire to get rid of any remaining dates still hanging around. And with that, he moved into the infamous attic apartment at Cranley Gardens. But now he had a problem. There were no convenient floorboards to store the bodies, no backyard to burn their remains when he was done with them. At first, he thought, okay, great. If I can't get rid of them, then I won't be compelled to kill them. Later, he said he'd always been tormented by what he was doing, but he couldn't stop, which is probably why he subconsciously got himself caught in the end. But at the time, he thought the logistics of the new pad would keep him honest. Obviously, we all know how well that turned out. 3 more men were murdered there. And to get around the problem of what to do with them, he just cut them up into smaller pieces that fit down the toilet, or he boiled them down on the stove until they finally caught up with him. The victim they found in the drains and in his closet was 27-year-old Graham Allen. He'd been hailing a cab when Dennis ran across him and invited him back to his place for dinner. Though after the grisly discovery and arrest, he confessed to everything. He even showed police where he burned the bodies of his victims at the Melrose address. Nilsen was tried and convicted on 6 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Of the 15 men and boys killed by Des, only 8 of his victims were ever identified. Stephen Holmes, his first victim, we talked about him. Canadian tourist Kenneth Ockenden was killed with the cord to a pair of headphones while he listened to music in Dennis's apartment. 16-year-old Martin Duffy was drowned in the kitchen sink, and William Sutherland was strangled. They were his only identified victims from 1980. Then there was a string of 7 more men whose names he didn't catch before he killed and used them like the others. And the last man to die at the Melrose address was 24-year-old Malcolm Barlow. Interestingly, he found Malcolm outside his building suffering from some bad side effects of the epilepsy medication he took for his seizures. He actually took him to the hospital, but the next day Malcolm came back around to thank him. Dennis invited him in. One thing led to another, and Malcolm never left the building again. His last 3 victims, John Howlett, Graham Allen, and Stephen Sinclair, were all strangled and dismembered at the attic flat. Dennis Nilsen, holy God, one true terror of humanity that defies understanding. Hell, he didn't fully understand himself. Now, the trauma of seeing his grandfather's body left him with this crippling sense of loneliness, so he made sure no one could ever leave him again unless he allowed them to. He never once expressed remorse for taking all those lives. And when people were horrified about the things he did to the corpses, here's what he said. A corpse is a thing. It can't feel. It can't suffer. If you're more upset by what I did to a corpse than what I did to a living person, then your morals are upside down. What the? This is the same guy that was adamant about making sure people knew he never penetrated the bodies. He did every other sexual thing, but not that. So, maybe calm down with the righteous indignation, you sick SOB. I'm always curious what these people do in jail. And according to allthat'sinteresting.com, Dennis spent most of his remaining years translating books into Braille. And get this, when Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested, Dennis had something to say about the American version of himself, and you won't believe it. He said he was probably lying about eating his victims. When they asked Dennis if he ever ate anyone, he said no. Quote, he was strictly an eggs and bacon man. He died in a prison hospital from a pulmonary embolism in May of 2018. He was 72 years old. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. If you like getting all the crime in half the time, you're in luck because Chris and I are here 3 times a week with new recaps. All you have to do to stay up to date on the latest episodes is tap that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss a thing. Until next time, don't go home with any strangers.